Welcome back to episode 4 of the Do-It-Yourself Western Holster Build series. This one's going to be a good one, so make sure you stick around. Today, we're going to talk about how to dye the leather and also the 2 different ways that I finish the leather. Because I'm going to finish the holster with a different finish on the outside than I used on the inside. And we're going to talk about that and the different reasons and places to use those finishes. Now, in our previous episode, I had cut out this piece of 28 gauge roofing tin that I was going to use as my metal stiffener. This is pretty flimsy stuff, and even though it is flimsy, it worked pretty well in the holster that I'm wearing, but it wasn't stiff enough for the holster that I made Tuco the Rat. For that, I wanted something that would give a true steel-lined holster appearance, and I picked up a drop of 20 gauge galvanized from the place I work at. And that is what we're going to use to do our steel lining in this holster. And this is going to be an extremely good fast draw holster when it's done. But you won't have to take my word for that, because when this holster is done, I'm going to send it to Santee of the Arizona Ghost Riders, and he's going to test it out for me. And you can ask him what he thinks of it. So when you cut out the metal, what I did is I went 3/8 of an inch smaller than the holster to allow for shaping and for stitching. And all you need is the throat of the holster and the belt loop. You don't have to steel line the whole thing. That's enough about the steel lining, and we'll get to putting that together another day. The dye I'll be using today is Phoebing's, and I'm using the light brown color. The 2 finishes that I'm using are Phoebing's Leather Balm and their Glycerin Saddle Soap. All the tools you're going to need today: a couple of disposable foam brushes, and you should probably put some rubber gloves on. Then you're going to want to have 3 microfiber rags. These are just easily available in the car cleaning section, and you won't want to do this without them. Let's get started. So what we're going to do here is start dyeing. I'm going to set the lining leather aside. Before I do that, I should mention, because I don't remember if I mentioned it in the previous video, you don't want to cut your lining leather to size. You're going to want to leave it larger than the holster, like I have it here. Also, it's a good idea to not do what I'm doing and put on some grungy clothes while you're dyeing, because you'll probably get some on your clothes and change the clothes color a little bit. I'm going to take a new foam brush, and these are just the 99-cent foam applicators from Menards. You just paint the dye on with that. Now I realize this isn't necessarily the most interesting thing to watch, but I'm going to include this part of the process for anyone who's interested. If you're doing an unlined holster that you want to leave the inside natural on, you're going to want to be fairly careful with how you apply the dye so that you don't get any on the back. This holster is going to be steel lined and lined with the thinner leather, so it really doesn't matter if I spill a little. One of the reasons that I like to use these disposable foam brushes is that if you leave the dye in your brush and you go to use it again later, I found it darkens the pigment and you get a much darker looking holster than you would if you use a fresh brush. These are cheap enough to just use, and throw away, and then you get the true color of the dye. And I've packaged it down from the bottle that I showed you in the beginning of the video to a little jelly jar, which makes it, you can see it makes it a lot easier to just dip the dye brush in than if you were trying to work out of the full quart jug. But if you buy the dye in a 4-ounce bottle, then it is pretty easy to work with straight out of the bottle you buy it in. I'm going to set that aside. And now I'm going to dye this whole piece of lining leather. Even though I won't be using it all, a lot of this is going to get cut off and thrown in the wastebasket because it's obviously oversized. But rather than trying to dye a little piece of it and save time and effort, it actually saves a lot more time and effort to dye the whole thing. And in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't really cost anything extra. If you're thinking of like the cost of the dye, it's negligible in a real world scenario. And I did the holster first for a reason. Because after you dye the holster, and like I said, I'm going to use the Phoebing's Atom Balm on that. The dye needs to dry out. And it's important that you let the dye dry out before you try to apply the Phoebing's Atom Balm. But doing the saddle soap like I'm going to do on this piece, it works better if the dye is still just slightly moist. You can see there's a few streaks in here, and you can keep going until you get it almost black. The color almost depends on how much you dye it. And I'm going a little darker than I normally would because some of it's going to lift off as I do the saddle soaping. Now the reason that I'm doing the lining with saddle soap and the holster with leather balm, in order to apply the saddle soap, it requires a large amount of rubbing. And with that much hard rubbing that you're going to see me doing in a second here, it will distort the tooling on the holster. You'll wind up tearing it up. I'm not sure if you can see my crock full of water over there or not, but I just dunked my rag into some water and I'm just rubbing it on the saddle soap bar here. Set that aside. We'll just work up a nice lather. I've also found that doing this to the lining of the holster makes it have a real nice balance between being smooth and having a certain amount of tack to it. And when I say that, I mean, to explain that a little better, I would be saying that it will grip your gun a little bit, but it will also allow your gun to slide out nicely for a fast draw. And I'm just going to keep on buffing this up And you can see, like I said, that I'm getting some dye lifting off. And this is the first rag. Remember I said you'll want 3. Well, this is rag number 1. You'll want to keep your 3 rags separate from each other. You don't want to interchange them, because I'm going to use this one that's fairly wet to work that glycerin saddle soap into the leather. I'm going to use the second one to buff this to a high gloss, and I'm going to use the third one to buff the leather balm to a high gloss on the outside portion of the holster. I'm going to pause the video so it doesn't get too long, and I'm going to keep going, and I'll come back when I'm buffing this to a high gloss. I realized my mic was off for that previous segment. I apologize for that, but I didn't really say anything important. And we'll go over everything that I did say. But you can see here, I've applied the balm with my foam brush, and now I'm just buffing it with my third clean rag. It's important to have a clean microfiber rag in order to get the nice high luster. And I'll probably go over this a couple more times after this video, give it a couple more coats of leather balm, and buff it again until it's got a real nice high gloss shine. But you can see that it shines up shinier than the paraffin saddle soap does, or the glycerin saddle soap I should say. But the reason that I like to use the saddle soap on smooth things, like the gun belt that Tuco the Rat had me build him, the Paladin rig. That was completely finished with saddle soap. But in order to get this tooling to shine up, the leather balm takes a lot less friction to get to a high gloss. Now, I haven't let it dry out quite enough to get this buffed up, but you'll see it buffed up in the next episode when this tooling is all shined up. Or I might put up a post on my YouTube page here later today or early tomorrow with the completely balmed and shiny piece here. With the saddle soaping, in that block between when I finished with the wet rag, or when I stopped recording with the wet rag, to when I started buffing with the dry rag and with no sound, that was about a 15-minute cut there. So that's a rather time-consuming project. Whereas this, you apply the balm and you walk away until it's dry, which if I'd walked away for longer, I could buff that floral section, but it's still too wet to buff. But you can see here that this gets a really nice high gloss to it. And I'll go over this with a couple more coats yet. Get rid of that dull spot there and get everything to shine like that. I greatly appreciate all of you who have made it this far in the video, and to anyone who's wanting to learn how to make their own custom leather holsters. So now we have this balmed with our Phoebing's leather balm, and our lining leather finished with our glycerin saddle soap. Like I said in the part where I had no sound, which again I apologize for, this is the way that the entire Paladin rig was finished. The way that I finished that. Now in the next episode of the holster build series, I'm going to take this piece of steel, this piece of leather, and this piece of leather, and make a holster out of it. And then when it's all done, it's getting shipped off to Santee at the Arizona Ghost Riders, and he can tell you what he thinks about it. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next video.